So in the first 5 podcasts, we covered a lot, yeah, and we covered a lot of deep topics. So today we're going to go even deeper, well, to the deepest, so to speak, and we're going to speak about the actual foundation of the universe. So when we talk about Brahman in Sanskrit, which you find in Vedanta, Tao and Taoism, and Sunyata in Buddhism, but we need to make a distinction, because the thing is that what a lot of people don't understand, especially when they come from kind of Western thinking and Christian thinking, is they think of Brahman, Tao, Sunyata in the sense of how we would think about God in Christianity or you know, in the West in general. A lot of people actually, when they hear the word God, they instantly think of a creator, right? I think they think of a creator, and that's not really what those three are. And I made a video about that, as you know, towards the end of last year, why we shouldn't use the word God, and some people, you know, annoyed them, and most people understand, but there needs to be a clarification. And because like when we are talking about Brahman, Tao, Shunyata, we're not talking about God as a creator. And you know, that's a thing, especially not just in Western modern thinking, but in Eastern thinking. When people say God, they think of a creator, right? They think of someone or something or some being who is lording it over the world and is blessing particular people and condemning others. And then so you have this very karmic-centric reality where it's based on reward and punishment. That's the kind of idea that people think of, right, in modern day. So whereas Brahman, Tao, or Shunyata is this kind of this reality that is beyond all comprehension. You know, we give it a name. It's like in the Upanishads, right? In the Upanishads, they say, paradoxically, they say the one who knows Brahman does not know Brahman, and the one who does not know Brahman knows Brahman, if that makes sense. And why they say that is because when you have a conception of what it is, when you have an object of knowledge, or you've turned it, well, having a conception of what it is turning it into an object, specifically. So you're turning Brahman then into just how Christians or the Abrahamic religions would turn God into some being or Lord, you know.
Something outside of yourself.
Something outside of yourself. Making, again, and this is the heart of psychological problems around the world, because then you make a distinction of God is separate from a human being and from nature itself. So as you know, within certain Abrahamic religions, there is this idea that God is not in the world and you are not a part of that. This is why you are a sinner, you know. But as we know in Eastern thought, it's you are part of the world, and you are also part of Brahman. You know, your deep down essence, each and every one of us is Atman, is actually identical with the Brahman.
Yes, that in other words, we call it like absolute consciousness. And that absolute consciousness is a very force of all creation. And that's in all of us, from human species to ant or plant, grass. So we are part of it, and we are it as well. And that's that Eastern philosophical way of think about what God is, if we wanted to call it as God. Whereas especially Abrahamic religion, a very monotheistic religion, meaning that they believe this one particular God, which they give a name and form. And there's also like lots of rules in it as well, so that mold the followers in certain way, I believe personally. And you ought to believe what the religion tells you to believe, and behave what that religion tells you to behave. And so we are not in that model of thinking, we are not part of the God. That God is someone who we supposed to appease to. We supposed to please the God from our own life, yeah, and whichever that might be. Well, most likely for Christians, whatever the Bible says, that'll be a very way to live their own life and way to even think. And Islamic religion will be Quran. And yeah, the Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, those countries, Quran is like their constitution. They run the country by Quran and things like that. So it's a huge part of humanity, actually. But we need to know that what that kind of religious behavior, way of thinking, way of living will affect individuals.
Well, it can lead to fanaticism, right?
Yes.
So when you have a religion that says that this is the actual way it is, and you believe that to its nth degree, then you will defend that like your life depends on it. And so that's where the problems are. You know, like when we look at Eastern thought, if we look at Vedanta, Taoism, and say Zen Buddhism, the idea is you have to get beyond religion, you have to get beyond conceptual frameworks, you have to get beyond all of this to understand what the Brahman or the Tao or Sunyata is. You have to get beyond all of that. So if you're looking at these and you're developing your own religious framework and worldview through, say, Hinduism or something like this, then that is actually counterintuitive to the tradition. Because the tradition is about getting rid of those concepts and finding the true essence of reality beyond name and form. You know, so if we look at specifically, if we look at the Shiva tradition in Hinduism, if we look at the worship of Shiva, Shiva itself is beyond all concepts of thought. Shiva here being the representative of Brahman, the ultimate reality, but the idea, then the imagery of Shiva is about that ultimate place that is not bound to any sort of religion or some sort of worldview. It's a direct path to the Brahman or the Tao, or call it whatever it is. It's a direct path to that irreducible essence. And some of the problems within those Abrahamic religions stem from political analogies of the traditions going back thousands of years. So, you know, there is a lot of speculation that they once upon a time did have a perspective very similar to, say, Hinduism, where you had the Brahman, which was inconceivable with words, with intellectual logical conclusions, but you can come into an experiential reality with that, you know, which is part of the focus of meditation. But what happened was, through people and leaders such as Akhenaten in Egypt, and also Darius I in Babylon, you get this idea of a monarchical view of the universe, where you have a lord, and then, you know, it's like it's a kingly version of the world, and ironically, they were kings and they were leaders, and they based their religion and worldview on that, which infected their Abrahamic beliefs through time. And scholars have explained this. Well, Alan Watts used to talk about this as well, and would explain it to him, having come through Christian training, would explain this to his fellow priests and so forth and so on. But there's a lack of acceptance of that, do you know what I mean? So, which is very strange, because, like, for example, even, like, it's not related, but when you say to a Buddhist, if you say that the Buddha himself was not a historical figure and it's more so related to mythology, most Buddhists don't really care if it's true or false. Do you know what I mean? Because what's true is the teachings of that either myth or an actual historical figure who existed. So, but when you expose those things to, say, a Christian about the monarchical view of the universe, how God has been turned into this king, and then we become a subject to something higher than us and inferior and not related to that, then they don't want to accept that, because that kind of distorts their worldview of what they've been trained and what the Bible says, and so forth and so on. But you have to look at history, and you have to look at historical figures like Akhenaten and Darius I to find these. But that again builds the idea, and see, that has built the Western view, that idea, that political analogy of the universe that especially Darius I promoted, has infected Western thinking of God. That's why one of the reasons I made that video, why we shouldn't use the word God, because our view of God is a monarchical view. It's a view that we are inferior, it is superior to us, and we're not connected to it. And what does this lead into? It leads into all sorts of crazy thinking, like we can use the environment for our own needs. We don't think then about nature. So we have this very, individualistic, centric religion, which becomes a self-interested religion, and it doesn't take in the totality, and it's not a holistic philosophy. So as you know, like the Eastern philosophies, being holistic philosophies, will explain in some sense that even though we are human, and yes, it is very fortunate to be born as a human, you don't want to get too far ahead of yourself, because from a planetary level, you're no more important than an ant, But if you pose that to, say, in one of the Abrahamic religions, they will have a negative reaction to that, because no, humans are way more important than an ant. And it's like, well, just take ants out of the environment and see what's going to happen to the whole ecosystem, So there's going to be trouble, you know what I mean? So in some sense, the Eastern perspective of the Godhead, we should use the Godhead here as some sort of, to differentiate it from God, is a holistic perspective and takes into account everything as one, actually, as opposed to making some sort of division between form, actually.
Yes, when we look at Eastern wisdom traditions, like we call it religion, the Eastern religions originated from Eastern philosophy, and the philosophy turned into kind of religion. It created a group of people who follow the specific philosophy and created something called religion. So it's very strongly philosophy based. Like, for instance, Buddhism is a very good example. Like you just said, Buddhists don't really care whether Buddha really existed or not. The teaching itself is very important, and they themselves understand how it helps their life, the Buddha's teaching is so significantly helping their life to to follow the path to their true happiness. So very philosophical, but I don't know if we can say philosophical to Abrahamic religion. Maybe we can in a certain degree, but not in a way that we think of Eastern religions, right? Then I kind of think of like, what is it? You know what I mean? And that's the reason why we feel very feel somewhat negative when we hear the word called religion, because most people think of religion as in Christian, Catholic, or Islamic, this kind of Abrahamic religion. So I try to think of how, like you just said, how it began, how that Western way of thinking began. We're going back to Akhenaten in ancient Egypt, and Darius the second, and the king, and in Persia. So we're going back very Babylon. Going very back, and that's how the way of the framework of their mind they built, and that's how it began. And it's not very. We can't really say it's very philosophical.
No, well, the thing is, to elaborate on what you're saying, Zen Master Kun Yamada, he kind of had a dialogue about this and was saying that there is a difference between faith-based spirituality and experience-based spirituality. And so what we're kind of talking about here, what you're mentioning, is basically, that's the dichotomy there, that's the opposition of the Abrahamic religions are faith-based religions. So they're based on, you need to accept the Bible or the Quran as the truth and apply your life to it. Whereas if we look at Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, they're experiential-based spirituality. So you have to put the work in. You know what I mean? That's why there's a lot of focus on meditation, a lot of focus on psychology. And as you said, they're philosophically based systems. So they're not, in some sense, a religion because they're based on philosophy and also science. There's a combination of understanding the world, understanding consciousness, understanding the mind, and also having a philosophical perspective of, you know, how we exist in this world and what's the purpose of our life here. This is why Hindus, you know, also Taoists and Buddhists, they have a sort of a nervous reaction when people call them a religion, because if we look at Hinduism, for example, Hinduism itself and is technically a culture. You know, Bharat is the culture of Bharat. It's a ancient culture, the longest enduring culture in the world, and it itself, when you mention the Hindus, they don't accept it as a religion because it's more so a way of life. Being a Hindu is a way of life, and that's why when you're in India, it's amazing, it's beautiful, because you're walking down the streets and there might be a shrine to Shiva and then one Ganesha down the road, and I mean they're on every corner. You know, I mean some roads you've got like 100 temples, and there might be like 2 houses in the street. So, but that's the beauty of the place, you know what I mean? It's a way of life, and it's not a religion. A religion, as you said, a religion, the way that we think about it, is belief-based. So you have to believe something, and this and that, and this is why people have a sort of a nervous reaction when they hear the word religion in the modern day, because in some sense, belief-based systems don't really apply to modern psychology because, you know, first of all, our intellect has developed a lot more than a few thousand years ago, and we have access to a lot more information. You know, we live in the information age, and so a lot more people can make up their own mind. But when people come across Eastern spirituality, there's something, why it's ringing a bell, Eastern spirituality, is because it addresses the human condition. Do you know what I mean? It addresses human suffering. All three of those traditions address human suffering, first and foremost, before you get into any practice. Before you get into any, you know, deep philosophy, they address the situation that you suffer. Why do you suffer? And this is the original starting place. Whereas the Abrahamic religions don't address the human condition. You just need to believe in God, and that can bypass all your suffering, so to speak. But then you see these people, and they're very, you know, they can be toxic personalities. And
yeah, because they'll have to suppress it.
They have to suppress it, yeah.
And while they don't even know.
While they don't know, exactly. Whereas if you're going to follow the path of Eastern spirituality, man, you got to dive deep, and you got to work through all of those samskaras, those vasanas, all those karmic tendencies that we have, and you've got to see that. Wait up, maybe I'm not as well adjusted as I thought I was before I come on this path, you know. And we all need to realize that, right? Like when you and I first came across Eastern spirituality many moons ago, it was a realization that, okay, like I got to put my life in order here. I got to check myself a little bit, because what's being revealed is that I'm not as well adjusted as what I thought I was, and I'm not as peaceful as what I thought I was, and I'm not, my worldview is warped. And these are the realizations that you come to. So Eastern spirituality, in and of itself, is a philosophical and scientific path based on trying to end human suffering, to liberate yourself. They're paths of liberation. You know, they're not paths of belief. So, for example, the way that you understand the knowledge of Brahman, so, you know, we all live in the ignorance of Brahman, right? So we don't know Brahman exists because we're all caught up in the jiva, in the personality, and we're caught up in duality. So this non-dual reality, that's the foundation of consciousness, that is consciousness itself, at the base of our existence. We don't know that that exists. But what do these Eastern spiritual paths say? That once you put the work in and once you realize liberation, you experience nirvana or moksha, satori, then that's when you know, that's when you know. You don't know that through belief.
Belief for reading Bible.
Yeah, belief through reading Bible. And this is why Shankara actually said in the Atma Bodha, said that only a jnani, so one who follows the path of knowledge, can really understand the knowledge of Brahman. So why he's saying that is because, like, when we look at the paths of yoga, the four paths, if we look at bhakti, karma, or the three paths, sorry, bhakti, karma, and jhana, someone who's very devotional in bhakti are very emotionally oriented, but they lack a firm experience of Brahman, you know. So Shankara was kind of saying that that's all well and good. You need to actually, obviously, be emotionally healthy, you know what I mean? And there's nothing wrong with having love and devotion for the deity that you follow, be it Shiva or whoever. But if you're not following that path of knowledge and trying to come into the recognition of who you truly are, then all of that's, that's secondary, you know what I mean? You need to really firmly come into that understanding of the knowledge of Brahman.
Yeah, we need to progress, I think. Yeah, whichever path you follow, you need to progress. That's inevitable, because you can be bhakti and you show all this love and respect for this God, like Hindu God, for instance, whoever you worship to. It's important, but if you don't progress in your own path, meaning understanding what that is, let's say what in Hinduism, what God means, what they are, what they represent, or what that means to you, and also experiential knowledge that you get it from while you're doing this daily worship a few times a day. And same, the kami jnani, the same. And if you just follow without, if you just follow like a bit like I don't know, like chore, like just something that you feel like you need to do, then it won't do anything, obviously. And the progress means that you put in action. So you put in practice, physical practice, meaning can be meditation or just self-inquiry, mindfulness in daily life while, let's say, while you cook, while you walk, and also reading sutras and any other books that you would like to read. And those two things have to come together to make the progress, whichever path you follow. That's inevitable. Nothing is for free. We know that. Especially to know who we are and what we are and what all this world is about. It's a difficult task. It's a lifetime task. So we have to continue to do this work to be able to see what the awakened one saw.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the path of Eastern spirituality. You have to actually apply yourself to the path. So if you're following Zen Buddhism, if you're not practicing Zazen every day, you're not going to come to the experiential knowledge that all the great Zen masters before have came to. So you have to apply yourself to the tradition. As you said, nothing's for free in any of these paths. And so getting back to also the karmi, the bhakti, and the jnana perspective, like, so you need to have, like, jnana should be your focus, right? Because you need to understand the knowledge of Brahman. You have to come to that conclusion. But a healthy person practices all three, so to speak, because then if you're practicing bhakti yoga, you're taking care of your emotional realm, your emotional center, and also if you're looking at the karma perspective, you're taking care of how you act in the world, like you're serving the world, so to speak, in whatever path it is that you follow. And so if you have all three of those in sync together, then you're what you would call an integral being or a complete whole human, you know. But the path has to be, the path of knowledge has to be the center of your spiritual practice or your spiritual path. And that's in all of the traditions too. Like you said, you can't come into this like half-hearted. You have to go all the way. And what you and I have noticed from, you know, me doing my channel for a long time now and writing books and so forth and so on, we come across a lot of people who seem to be sort of casuals with decent spirituality and are in some sense afraid to dive right in. Obviously there's a small percentage with my audience that are like that, but most of are very sincere. But you do find that in the modern day, there's a lot of people are casual about everything. You know what I mean? They're casual about learning music or casual about learning knowledge. They're not wholehearted in the whatever it is that they want to follow, in whatever path they want to follow. And that's, well, I don't really understand that from an Eastern spiritual perspective, because once you understand that these paths are the actual path to liberation, then this should be the central focus for all of us, you know. And it actually nourishes your intellectual life, your working life, and it's not a belief-based system, but it's an experiential-based system. You're trying to, in a sense, complete the path of yoga, that yoking, that yug, that divine union that we think we're eclipsed from, but we're not. It's just a change of orientation. It's a getting out of that partial perspective of duality, as Zhuangzi would say, getting out of that partiality and realizing that reality itself is non-partial. So we're often trained in this and that all the time, which is, again, confusing our psychology. And this is why the idea of God as a creator comes from the idea of this and that. This is the game of black and white, as what Alan Watts would say. That even falls into that game. You know what I mean? So when people talk about the love and the oneness and the unity of God, but then they talk about it in a partial perspective, that's paradoxical. It doesn't make sense. It's contradictory, you know, because it's an impartial reality. We're just trained dualistically. And that's what people don't understand. This is why we think of things in the way that we do. We think of, you know, he said, she said, you know, they're bad, he's good. The list goes on, you know. But if you have an impartial perspective, you can see the actual reality. And a lot of people then say, but how does that benefit my life? I've got to get it and listen. And it's like, well, you're not really sincere about it. You're not committed to the path. Because you're making excuses for your ego. And your ego is just a result of that dualistic thinking. It's a byproduct of duality, your ego is. You've made it, you've formed this ego, which is solidified in your mind, and then you begin to protect it, but it's a mirage.
It's a very strong habit that we have been having since when we were very young. Yeah. So it's hard to get out of that different way of thinking. And yeah, that habit, thinking itself is a habit. And yeah, in the brain, we talked about this a lot, that in the neurons in our brain, they fires in a certain way and it creates a certain chemical reaction and creates a certain chemical liquid in the brain, the hormone. And it's been working like that for so long, just like our muscle, right? We keep working on the same, like bicep, like doing same movement. you'll get that muscle so strong, right?
Yeah.
Same thing. It's a habit that way we have been thinking for so long, and I know it's very difficult to change it, but with small steps, we have to change it step by step.
But it's almost like you don't have to. It's almost like you can't actively change it, but it naturally changes through practice and through a reorientation of your perspective of the world. But yeah, it does change. But it's like for example, I said to you, go out and change it right now. It's impossible. You know what I mean? If you haven't meditated and you haven't studied deep philosophical books, and you haven't had access to the knowledge that gives you that clear reality of that impartial view, you know. But you have to, again, like when we look at it from a philosophical and psychological perspective, and we look at, like you said, with the mind and everything, that it's naturally geared to, trained to see this and that, right and wrong, black and white, so to speak, you know. But what you do when you start to taper back that habit through meditation and through self-observation, then you see that habit is actually confusing the reality for you, and also it doesn't serve you at all, because then you start to, what does that do? That evokes fear, that evokes self-interest, protection. All of that is from that perspective, right? Because you're trying to protect something that doesn't really exist. The ego is an illusion, and you're trying to protect that, you know. So the idea is to taper that back and get rid of that. Not get rid of it. You'll get rid of it through practice and everything like that.
You will get to a stage where you will be able to see your behavior as if like you are a third party. Like you become a pure witness of it. Then, but you will catch it. You'll be able to catch it before you actually act out of it.
Yeah.
And that's very, very good sign.
Yeah, of course.
That's how we can actually break the habit.
Yeah. Well, from an Eastern view, the nature of thoughts themselves are thought of as unsupported thoughts. So they're spontaneously, like everything else in existence, right? You grew spontaneously, this flower grew spontaneously, everything grew spontaneously from the organic realm. Thoughts themselves are unsupported as well, and they grow like this, one at a time, unsupported. This is from the Eastern perspective, right? But the problem is when we start to train ourselves to connect. We do this on a subtle level because we're training young children to think of themselves in a certain way and to make this continuity of thought to, you know, promote their existence. Then you solidify the ego. So the way that we naturally think of thoughts is that thoughts is this chain of thoughts, right? But what happens is, because of our habit of past and future, the way we train because of that, we start to connect our thoughts, and it creates this chain of thoughts, which then creates and solidifies this idea of a self or a person. And so you have this continuity of thoughts, which then creates this ego. And so what meditation does is that when you're meditating, you're observing thoughts bubbling up, like one at a time. Obviously, it's not as easy as that, because you will wander with your mind sometimes, but that's again the linkage of thoughts. That's dragging you down into this illusion that doesn't even exist, because you're fantasizing or you're daydreaming about something. Your mind is wandering, right? So deep meditation is about catching those spontaneous thoughts and realizing them and just watching them bubble up. And what this does is the continual practice of that is that this is a Zen practice, not just a Zen practice, but it's a practice of meditation in general, is that then you begin to live a life that's very impartial, because you're not connecting those thoughts, creating this continuity of thought, which then continuity of self and thinking, which sees the world in that way, So your meditation is like a spiritual solvent on your thoughts, because you don't want them to stick, because once they stick, then it creates this chain of thoughts, and the next minute you become this so-called ego that you believe in.
Yeah, that's very important to be aware of that thinking popping up all the time. But I guess a lot of people who have been meditating for a long time may have experienced all the same things. That because of that chain of thoughts, it began from something, right? Something that happened from yesterday, or just far back memories just came up for no reason. That's what mind does. It just pops up. And then next minute you are thinking of something completely unrelated. But that chain of thinking, mind wandering, happens like in a split second. Happens so fast. So more than not, we actually not able to catch it when the origin of thought popped up. We don't. If we can catch it, oh yeah, well that's very good. But all of a sudden we kind of find ourselves that thinking something completely unrelated, and we're like oh, why am I thinking this now? But important thing is that you became aware of that, and now you can just be back to the present moment, practicing breathing exercise or just back to body sensations. But if I sometimes do this, if I find myself that I was far back, my thoughts traveled quite far away from where it started, right? And I track back, where did that thought come from? And it come from something different. And then where did that one come from? And come back. And how come did that come from? And then back to the very origin of thoughts. Then a lot of those thoughts come from memories. And what also that does is that it brings up that emotion that we had in that very moment of experience, the memories. Like it could be good emotions, but I think most of times it could be negative emotions, because that's why you may have been storing those thoughts in your memory box. Yeah. So then you are able to see what you felt in that very moment, and that gives you opportunity to investigate that emotion. Let's say jealousy or envy, for example. Why do I have it? And a lot of the times that jealousy and envy come from fear. Then once you investigate back to that fear stage, then why am I so fearful about this? And it can naturally be back to being very compassionate to yourself as well. Like, oh, I was fearful about this, I didn't know that. We just act out of that emotion. Oh, jealousy, envy, you just get angry about something, like, or you don't feel that you got treated fairly, something like this. But that reaction come from that kind of emotion, jealousy and envy, and the jealousy, envy originated from the fear. Then you are much more aware of yourself and your emotional stages that you go through, and you become very compassionate to yourself. And once you train yourself in the meditation more and more, you naturally become compassionate to others. And in that place of consciousness, that naturally this impartial perspective arises, I think. You don't have to... obviously, gaining knowledge is very important. We have to understand what that is. But also from meditation, it's experiential. You can experience your own emotions. You can investigate your own thoughts, your own mind, that you trace back to the very beginning of that problem, that allows you to see the reality much clearer. Yeah.
Exactly. It's not easy to get into those samskaras, though, into those subconscious imprints that, because tracing the origin of thoughts can be difficult and also hard to you know.
You have to be very focused and concentrated.
Yeah, but it can be hard to find the origin sometimes, right? Because you're talking about can be a childhood problem that you had. You know what I mean? Like the point from the Eastern perspective is your mind is empty, spontaneous, and free. And when thinking becomes a problem, that's the result of us filling our mind up full of life, full of experiences that we then, like you said, the memory influences your thinking, and then that influences how you feel, your behavior. Like if you become jealous in a moment, or in a situation, or envious, then this is all, as you said, you can trace this back to find its so-called origin, and yeah, if you look at it from the Eastern perspective as that the mind is naturally empty, spontaneous, and free, we're going the wrong way about how we live our lives, because we're filling our mind up full of a lot of external stimuli and information, and our mind, naturally, the subconscious just eats everything up. And so once it eats everything up, then these thoughts that arise are almost, in a sense, not even really your thoughts. You're almost influenced, almost your emotions and that, like if you're jealous and this and that, are almost, in some sense, can be influenced by just life, having lived life, and it's not really naturally a part of your psychology. From an Eastern perspective, it isn't. It's something that you've accumulated through your life circumstance. So then what happens is that when a situation arises, then that natural thought or that familiarity from the subconscious arises. And then next minute, that past begins this linkage of thoughts, because you feel associated with that situation. And then next minute, your thoughts begin to wander and, in a sense, hallucinate, because that's how jealousy and that occurs, because you're essentially hallucinating on a past experience, but projecting that onto a present experience, which in some sense can be completely different, but you're seeing it that way. You're intuiting it that way based on your past experience, when in some sense it's completely different. We see this with relationships, right, where one or the other may have jealousy problems, but it's based on past experiences. It's not that, in some sense, that they don't trust that person. It's just that their frame of reference is based on the past, that they might have had a troubled relationship in the past, So, but the reality is that relationship is, there's no need for that person to be jealous, but they're caught in this habit of linking those thoughts and creating this illusion of what's happening, the reality and the self that they have. So we have to understand that the thoughts themselves are non-dual, they're unsupported. And only through strict self-observation and spiritual practice can we understand that thoughts arise spontaneously. They're not in and of themselves like independent. They're not independent. So actually, I shouldn't say independent. Their thoughts themselves depend on other thoughts to link and to have this illusion of what you're experiencing, or this illusion of yourself. So we need to come into understand that these thoughts are unsupported. They're not connected with any other thought, and we have to get out of that habit of linking them up and then creating this illusion in our mind of what is happening, this reality that's happening.
Yeah, I like what you said about the association. That is, in other words, like we identify with that memory and that feeling that you had in that moment, right? Mm-hmm. And we identify ourselves with that feeling, and also, we associate ourselves with that person who feels it that way. That creates this, persona, the ego. And we need to train ourselves to catch that moment that we try, with our mind, to try to associate ourselves with that, identify with that. But instead of identifying with that, we need to come back a few steps back, and that is, you just let it be, let those let those thoughts arises and let it also go as well, because that's what it does. If you choose not to give too much attention, it has no meaning, it has no power.
Yeah.
It's totally up to you to decide whether you want to get into it or not.
Well, you will know what thought is natural and what is not. You know, what I mean by natural is a thought that arises because of a situation that you have to take care of. Like if there's, action that needs to be applied, like you have to wash the dishes, for example, that thought will arise and you'll wash the dishes. It's a natural thought. But most of our thoughts are not like that. Like Alan Watts once said beautifully, was that we've got nothing else to do but just to think thoughts. That's all we're doing. We're just thinking thoughts. We're in this habit of just thinking thoughts. And majority of our thoughts, probably 99% of our thoughts, are actual rubbish. They don't equate to the situation that we're in or what we need to do in that moment. Can be like, you can be ruminating on these thoughts a lot that don't exist. How often have we all experienced where we think a certain situation is the way it is, so we'll be very anxious or nervous about something that's going to happen the next day. You're thinking that it's going to happen, but it didn't happen. And so you invested all of this energy on these thoughts and this thinking on something that didn't even happen. And we've all experienced that. And that eclipses what's actually happening in the present moment. Your mind's off in the future, and then your mind has created this illusion for yourself where you begin to fantasize or sort of daydream about what's going to happen. And it didn't happen. And we've invested all of that energy in that. So you have to come to an understanding of what is sort of a natural thought that's arose because of a situation or a circumstance, and what is not, And that's easier said than done. We all fall victim to the wandering mind. Basically meditation is designed to make you aware of the wandering mind and a training method to stop you from mind wandering. But it doesn't mean, like, for example, you can be around masters and they will admit that their mind still wanders at times. It's not that it wholly disappears, but it loses its power and influence over them. They don't react to the wandering mind anymore. They observe it, they can tell, they can see where it is, and it doesn't grasp them, They don't grasp it. And that's one of the problems with this idea of thinking that we naturally have, is what happens is how we have this continuity of thought as the thought arises, and we grasp the thought. See? Once we grasp the thought, then you have this continuity of thinking, this train of thought. So like, I didn't like what she did. Next minute it goes out. Next minute you're in an argument with this person. You know what I mean? That's how it unfolds. But if you naturally see the thought and you observe it, and what you will notice is that it'll dissipate. Like snow on a sunny day. That's what will happen.
Yeah, it'll just melt away. It'll just disappear because it doesn't get the support, like you said. If you choose to look into it and get engaged into it, then you're gonna be gone for a few minutes. Who knows? Yes.
The reason why what we're talking about, how the thoughts create the ego and the unsupported thought is important to our discussion on Brahman and Tao and Sunyata, is because if we're looking at reality from that partiality, you can never understand that perspective, because partiality in and of itself is dualistic. And so if you're talking about Brahman, Tao, Sunyata, you're talking about a non-dual reality that's beyond all comprehension, beyond all intellectual speculation, beyond all conclusion. There is no logical conclusion that you can come to experience that reality. And so when you do train yourself in meditation to notice those spontaneous thoughts, then you do notice, well, I shouldn't say you do notice, but you do come into that field of experience. They would say in Zen, you come into the Zen experience where you'll experience Satori, and you're on that sort of level, You're on that level of Sunyata from the Buddhist perspective. But that's part of the training. We have to get back into that non-dual reality. that's actually our nature, and we can't do that through intellectual speculation and, you know, rigorous logic. I mean, you and I can sit here and speak today about it, and, you know, we're speaking about it just in general for people to think deeply about, but we're not fooling ourselves that speaking about it is actually going to give you the proper experience of it, you know what I mean? It's fun to talk about. It's the best thing to talk about, actually. But you can't fool yourself that, you know, rigorous intellectual inquiry into this is going to give you that actual experience, because it won't. You have to actually apply it you have to actually apply yourself to spiritual practices and keep your mind, as you said before, focused on a rigorous study of this to experience, to have the knowledge of Brahman. When they say the knowledge of Brahman in Vedanta, they're talking about the moving away from ignorance, because knowledge means kind of, in a sense, you know, right? You have the knowledge. So we're all caught in Maya, we're all caught in pure ignorance because our mind is partial, is dual, and we're trained like that. And the irony is that as we move out of ourselves, the further and further we get away from ourselves, then the harder it is to come back into that experience of our natural state, come back into that. You have to bring it back in. It's almost like we are almost like a miniature universe, you know, from where the Big Bang is, and the Big Bang's gone out. We've gone the universe has gone so far away from its actual source that you have all these planets and you have, you know, solar systems and humans and ants and so forth and so on. Same as us. We're born pure, fundamentally pure, and wholly connected to Brahman, Tao, Sunyata, but then as we go through life, we have parents, we have education, we have socialization, then we become this persona that we think we are. And fundamentally, it's impermanent, and it's going to die. It's not going to survive, you know what I mean? And we don't contemplate our mortality enough. That's one of the big problems in modern day. People think death is for someone else, not for you, but it's like, no, your persona, your body, it's on its way out. Even as we speak now, every day we're getting closer to that end, so to speak, you know. But the great knowledge and the understanding, especially in Advaita Vedanta, is that this, you can say that it has its experience in time, right? It has its experience in time. But what you truly are is not time-bound. So pure consciousness, which is the Atman within you, which is identical with Brahman, which is Brahman, is beyond time, space, and form. You know, time, space, and matter. Time, space, and matter are the three components of the universe, right? And the three defining characteristics of the universe. And consciousness as a foundation is before that, but it's within that. And it's not time-bound, it's ever-present. This is just a vehicle that you experience this in. But Advaita Vedanta take even a step further, because to gain the knowledge of Brahman, this is not even, doesn't even really exist in some sense. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't even really exist. And this gets into like Gaudapada's philosophy. So Gaudapada being Shankara's teacher's teacher, who a lot of people don't really know, and they should know if you read the Mandukya Karika. So that's kind of Gaudapada's commentary on the Mandukya Upanishad. I mean, it's like the bottom line for Advaita Vedanta, almost like the bottom line for non-dual philosophy in and of itself. Because when you look at that, it's such a strict non-dualism that it almost eliminates all sense of yourself, sense of your ego, you know. It's like there was I think it was a philosopher, his name was Jim Holt, and he was making a book he was writing a book and creating some articles and that on the origins of the universe, you know. And so he interviewed, you know, many respected physicists and philosophers and so forth and so on. And I forget, he spoke to one guy, and one guy kind of said, you know, explaining to him how difficult it is to conceive of the beginning of the universe and this. and this and that. And then at the end of that interview, he kind of said, who knows, maybe the Hindus are right. Atman is Brahman. And then Jim Holt, I think his name Jim Holt, I might be wrong here, but him being not that familiar, he dedicated a whole page to Vedanta. And then he gave it, some credit, but then at the end he's like, no, it can't be that. And then he went back to his normal thing. And why he says that is because, like, if we look at Gaudapada's philosophy is in a sense of, we could call it the non-origination theory. So the universe wasn't born. If you ask Gaudapada, like, how was the universe born? It wasn't born.
If there is a born, there is death.
There's death, yeah.
So
There was no born. This is an appearance. All of this is an appearance. This is the appearance, in a sense, of Maya. This is, like the snake and the rope analogy, right? Like, we look at the world and we're taking the rope to be a snake. We're not perceiving the non-dual Brahman. And Gaudapada's and Advaita Vedanta's philosophy in general is birthless and deathless. There is no birth, there is no death. This is an illusion of time. See? You were born guy young, you were told that you're going to be this and you do this your whole life, and then you get all scared when you're going to die at the end. Not you, but it's an example. And you're caught in this trap that you've identified wholeheartedly with your persona and your body, and you haven't invested anything on your actual self, the true self, the Atman, which is beyond time, space, and form. And that's why his philosophy is so revolutionary, because it's a non-origination theory. So if you ask Gaudapada, how was the universe born and how it will die? What are you talking about? There is no birth, there is no death. There's only Brahman. There's only Brahman. That's why Shankara said, and I've said this in podcasts before, the universe is unreal, Brahman is real, and the universe is Brahman. Saying that, for example, when you see the rope as a snake,
you're gone.
You're gone. It's not real. The universe is not real. But when you see the universe as Brahman, when you see that it's a rope, it's not a snake, then the universe is Brahman. You see, it's complete non-duality.
Yeah, that to me makes so much sense for me personally, and we were talking about this yesterday with the podcast that we were watching, like hydrogen. Space is made of hydrogen.
The whole universe.
The whole universe is we are hydrogen.
We are hydrogen, yeah.
And how consciousness began from hydrogen, and I can understand where that how that question came about, but I thought that question should be the other way around. How the hydrogen came from consciousness. Maybe a bit silly. It sounds a bit silly, but it's hard to think that matter can create the consciousness. I know lots of scientists and physicists will argue with this idea, but it's hard to think of this way that matter can create consciousness. That's why I know that these AI ideas that's been going on for some time now, and that science has been developing and progressing, that they're going to create this brain that's gonna work just like human brain. But I'm not so sure if that's possible to make it exactly the same, because human brain, we feel, we have emotions, and that's so much to do with our thoughts. And everything about our brain, the way it works, and again, that pure consciousness itself, how do we create it? And we coming to very complex topic to talk about, but it's a kind of forever mystery. But that Gaudapada, this idea that what are you talking about, this space and universe thing? Like, it's not that.
No.
We may not be able to see it, but it always there, everlasting. There was no birth, and there is no death. And again, the Buddha's awakening was the same thing. Whatever has form has birth, and whatever that had birth is going to disappear.
Yeah.
And that's the truth. Everybody knows it. That's the truth.
Universal, yeah.
We know that we cannot live forever.
No.
Yeah, so...
It's impossible. What lives forever is well, it doesn't have to live forever. It just is Brahman. It's consciousness, pure consciousness. You know.
Yeah.
So like, I like what you said, because when we were talking about the hydrogen in consciousness, that comes back to that whole argument if consciousness is part of matter and so forth and so on. But when we look at it from the Eastern perspective, consciousness is fundamental, and everything else is from that. And these are the realizations that quantum physicists have come across in the last 100 years, So you have this, they have that understanding that, hold the phone, like we're talking about matter and this and that, and matter itself is very lucid. It's a quantum reality. So consciousness itself is fundamental from their perspective, you know what I mean? So that's why you have like people like David Chalmers and that who coined the hard problem of consciousness, because what's fundamental is matter, time, space, whereas consciousness is fundamental. You know what I mean? Like, and it depends on how much you validate or appreciate the great traditions, because if you do, then you'll see that all the great teachers, Gaudapada, Nagarjuna, all of these, Shankara, they're all talking about consciousness being fundamental, or Brahman or Sunyata, or that mind space being fundamental. Call it whatever you will. And when we talk about consciousness here, we're not talking about like conscious thought. We're talking about the actual existence and pure awareness and pure presence. This is what we're talking about. A lot of people do confuse consciousness itself kind of with the mental activity. That's not what we're talking. Mental activity in and of itself is an outgrowth from consciousness as well. We're talking about consciousness in its purest form, pure consciousness, pure presence. And so that's the beauty of Gaudapada's philosophy, And you and I, obviously, big fans of Gaudapada, because like when you look at that from a sense, there's a lot of truth to it. Like you mentioned Buddha with anicca, with impermanence, and that there's a lot of truth to that. Like we look at the age of the universe, for example. Like we live a brief, if we're lucky, we can get over 100 years, right? And then we are making out like this 100 years is the be-all and end-all of everything. But most of the time of the universe has existed without you in it.
Yeah. To go back to the quantum physics, when I read about the quantum physics, and when we watched some video clips on experiment that they had in the quantum physics, that kind of blew my mind away, because they had this experiment that's showing that all these electrons are running around in the field, and it was just going here and there and everywhere. But once the observer appeared, that electron had a form. So that speaks a lot. So observer being consciousness, electron being matter.
Yeah, creates a reality.
Yes. So before consciousness, there is no form. The electrons going here and there. It's a wave, yes. It's just big field of wave. It has no form, no shape.
Wave of energy,
Yes. But once there's observer, the giving kind of attention, that creates the form and shape.
The wave can be the pure consciousness. You know what I mean? The wave can be Brahman, right? That's all that exists. There's just that energy that exists. And then once we are an observer, we observe and then we create, from a quantum physics perspective, you don't have to believe that, obviously, but then we create the reality, so to speak. It's not like it, there's a lot of, disagreement within quantum physics about that, but that is part of people's understanding of quantum physics is that that's how we create our reality. The observer creates the experience, so to speak,
Yeah, and that works exactly the same in a meditation practice. Thought has no meaning until you give attention.
Exactly.
So that's why that makes so much sense, and that's been kind of proven by science.
Yeah.
How our mind works, how our consciousness, the awakened state, works.
Well, we know that just from a general perspective too. Like if you look at it just from generally, if we're not even talking about atoms and electrons and neutrons and stuff like that, if you look at it from a general perspective, usually what you put a lot of your energy into and your focus is usually what you experience. So if you're a very negative person, right, and you're always looking on YouTube or something for negative things to watch, and then, we could blame the algorithm for this too, but then you go down this rabbit hole of like negativity. And then that extends out into your ordinary life, outside of your home life, and then you essentially are creating your reality. And we don't even have to think about it in a quantum physics perspective. We can just look at it from a general perspective. If your mind is focused on meditation and focused on liberation, and you will notice that your reality begins to, the ripples of the mind begin to flatten out. And you begin to experience this very tranquil reality. I don't even want to say like ecstatic reality, or it's just kind of a balanced world that you'll begin to experience, and that's what meditation practice and this and that does. Like what you said, when you begin to observe those thoughts and you don't identify with them, then you're not creating that reality for yourself.
You don't give life.
You don't give life to it. Yeah, exactly. You're not letting that breathe, right?
Yes.
So all there is the wave, so to speak. All there is Brahman. That's how you could relate it to quantum physics. All there is the wave. But the observer, and usually the observer is riddled with partiality. If you're looking at it just from a philosophical perspective, then they will create that reality for themselves going forward. But if the person is impartial, they almost can perceive the wave, the field of energy. It's not. I shouldn't say, because New Agers may take that out of context. You don't perceive an actual field of energy. I mean, like a feel of unity, a feel of oneness. It's a feeling. It's not so much like a perceptual thing. It's a feeling of that this is more than this idea of separate forms. It's a feeling of unity that you have deep inside yourself,
It's that sense of unity that you feel within yourself.
Yes. Yeah, so you don't have a sense of partiality then, right? You're not dissecting the world up into this and that to please your own agenda and please your own worldview, So you're doing the work to get out of that. And so, as you mentioned with the quantum physics, and when you look at consciousness from that perspective, if you look at the wave and you look at the observer, and if the wave is fundamental, then there's only consciousness, right? There's only this field of energy that we're experiencing somehow subjectively and misinterpreting that reality.
In our own conditioning.
And from our own conditioning, yeah. And Gaudapada Shankara, Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Buddha, Vyasa, they were all ahead of their time, you know what I mean? We're talking thousands of years ago with some of them. And that's what they were explaining. They're explaining that Om, for example, is the energy of the universe, right? Om is the symbol for Brahman, right? Is that subtle reality that we use for the Om mantra, but that's that reality that's beneath our sensory experience, you know, right? And physical matter and time and space. And so we have to come back in accord, or we have to become more conscious of that reality. And that's what will lead you into deeper states of bliss and deeper states of, well, that's what will lead you into liberation. And then the question then becomes is like, how willing are people to dive into that, you know? Because people will often throw up excuses that, oh, they have a day job and this and that, they have no time. We all have time, you know what I mean? We all have time. Let's not kid ourselves. There's always time, but we usually fill it up with unnecessary entertainment and just, you know, chit-chatting and stuff that's not necessary to and doesn't benefit your being. So we have to really come back into that, because what we need more people that can have that feeling of unity within themselves. Because if you have that sense of unity within yourself, then your ability to be compassionate, forgiving, and loving to other people is heightened. And that's what we need more in the world. We need more people like that. We don't need more people who cause more conflict, cause more drama. We don't need more trolls on the internet. We need more people who come into understanding and more maturity, you know, more maturity in the world. There is such a thing as spiritual maturity. And spiritual maturity comes from having an impartial perspective of the world, instead of, like, you know, judging the world according to how you want it to be.
Yeah, that's also, you could say, the real meaning of civilized human being.
Exactly.
Being a real human and act like one too.
Act like one, yeah.
Yeah.
Spiritual maturity is very underrated, you know. But it's something that we have to come back in accord with. And it's something sometimes, spiritual maturity, like they speak about in Buddhism, spiritual maturity sometimes develops over time. Actually, it does develop over time with your practice and your study, because then you are understanding life on a deeper level, not just intuitively, but also intellectually. And what you see with originally what we were talking about with the Abrahamic religions is that when you have a belief-based system, it can lead to fanaticism, which leads to an inability to communicate with people from other faiths and traditions. And this is a sign of spiritual immaturity, you know. So they may think that they're spiritual, but they lack communication, and it's hard to, you know, relate to other people.
Yeah, like you lose a bit of a perspective.
You lose perspective. That is a loss of perspective, right? Because you can't even communicate with other people, because you're seeing reality with glasses on, with rose-colored glasses. You can't see the reality as it truly is. And as one of my original points was, when we look at, like, for Vedanta, for example, Vedanta, Zen Buddhism, and we look at Taoism, they want you to go beyond, like, conceptual frameworks, beyond, because all of that's still Maya. It's still all Maya. You are still dissecting the world up into this and that. And then once you do that, that leads to spiritual immaturity, because you can't communicate with someone. You know how frustrating it is when you're trying to convey something to someone, but they only see reality the way that they see it, and they can't listen to your perspective, you know.
Yeah, that kind of conversation always goes one way, because you'd find that person very, very uptight and very dispensive, and yeah, it's not like a flexible and easy kind of conversation.
It's true. And I get that a lot on YouTube comments, like, because people will have their own interpretation of something which comes from a casual mindset, and they may have read it in one book, and they don't understand that this is my job and I do this full time. And that's a whole other story, you know what I mean? And then they get to a situation where I try to explain to someone that, no, the way it is, why it's like that is because of this. But then they will keep saying from their perspective, and which is, you know, no disrespect, but it's from a sort of a casual perspective. And so then at the end of the day, it just becomes too much work to try and, you know, explain, and then there's the frustration can develop, so you just sort of leave it. You just leave it, you know.
Yeah, the art of conversation is to have some fruitful outcome. But, well, in that case, it's pretty hard.
Well, online is full of it, right? So, Yeah, so getting back to Gaudapada, one of the things that is a misinterpretation from Westerners when they think of Eastern spirituality is that when we say Atman is Brahman, right? And when we talked about Gaudapada, the non-origination theory and stuff like that, Westerners can then think that, so Hindus and Buddhists and Taoists, they think they are God. And this is the problem, see?
The individual
Yeah.
is God.
Yeah. Because, like, earlier we were saying, or we've been saying all this podcast, was that Atman is Brahman. So there's, you deep down are identical with the ultimate reality, or the irreducible essence, call it whatever you will. But because of their lack of understanding of the mind, the ego, the jiva, so to speak, and the Atman, the true self, or the non-self in Buddhism, the Sunyata, the lack of understanding of that makes people believe that, they think they are God, So when they see someone, like, for example, when Nisargadatta Maharaj wrote, the book was transcribed, it's called I Am That. When Papaji claimed I Am That, and all this and that, people look at that and think, he thinks he's God, this guy. But it's not...
The God that they think of.
But it's not him as a person verifying that. Like, this is what the understanding needs to be. They need to think deeper. So, for example, like, we'll use Papaji as an example, right? And think of him what you will. I'm not sure if people either like him or hate him, but what he was trying to exhibit in that moment when he said, I am that, was that he's not Papaji. He's not this man that you see there. He's not this persona. What he truly is Brahman. And we're all that too. This is where people, they don't understand, see, because they think that he's saying it. It's like me just being Jason, like, who I am, and just saying, man, I'm Brahman, man, I'm God.
I'm enlightened.
I'm enlightened. So, bow down to me and this and that. That would be ridiculous, right? But if I explain to them carefully that he's the jiva, he's a person, but what I truly am deep down, and what you also are as well, is the Brahman, is that ultimate reality that's beyond time, space, and form. But a lot of people don't have access to the information, so that when they see Hindus, or specifically when they see Hindus or Vedantists making these statements, they think, oh man, like, thinks he's God, this guy. And they do think of, like what you said, they do think of God as in the sense of a creator. They don't understand what Brahman is, or Tao, or Shunyata is. Their idea is God as the creator, like, so they think that, this guy, he thinks he's the Lord, It's a lack of understanding, right? So, Tattvamasi, one of the great Mahavakyas, means that art thou, or thou art that, means that you are always that, ultimately. But your jiva, your persona, is part of Maya. It's part of the illusion of reality. Yes, it does get old and die and this and that, but what you are truly fundamentally is beyond death, birth, rebirth. That was one dialogue with Gaudapada when they were asking him about rebirth, and he's like, what's to be reborn? You're talking as if you have a birth, a death, and a rebirth, but what's to be reborn? And that's the perspective that I think, not that I think, but that's the perspective that a lot of people have to understand when they think about non-duality and Brahman and Tao and Shunyata.
Yeah, from that place, we no longer fear about death.
Exactly.
Because we stop identifying ourselves with this conditioned persona,
Yep.
which is finite. And we begin to see ourselves as the real self. And we always keep that in mind. And more as we continue to study and practice, we stop identifying with that person, then we come to realization that we don't. You just naturally no longer fear about death. Yeah.
Because there is no death.
Yes.
I mean, it's hard for us to understand, isn't it? Like, if Gaudapala existed, he'd just laugh at everyone. What are you afraid of death about? There is no such thing. You're talking about something that's an abstraction. It's a mirage in the desert. You know, soul's birth. You know, so. But getting our head around that is a difference. Is difficult, and that does require self-inquiry. It does require meditation. It does require a deeper introspection into the nature of yourself and the world in general.
That understanding also gives such relief that you would see from someone who were about to die, or people who discover themselves they are in like stage 4 cancer, for example. They have only a very small amount of time to live. We often get to hear from those people they no longer worry about little things anymore, and they truly try to enjoy life fully because they know that end is coming. But it doesn't have to be that way. Once we realize that we're not this, I think we can live life in the same manner.
Yeah, of course. You actually live a lot better.
Yes.
When you know, it's sad because you mentioned people dying. It's sad that when you often hear people turn to scriptures and that when they learn about maybe their stage 4 cancer or something like that, when they learn about these things, then they start turning to scripture because they're looking for answers, quick, smart, at what's going on. And my perspective has always been, you should engage in this stuff ASAP. Like, I mean, it doesn't matter what age, but as soon as possible, as you hear about the path of liberation, you need to engage yourself in this, and you need to free yourself from this bondage of life that, yes, you think you are born, you think you die. You need to free yourself from that bondage, you know, because that is a bondage, right? And so a jivan mukta, one liberated in this life, is liberated from the illusion of birth and death. And how is their attitude and their behavior, a jivan mukta? Very blissful, they encapsulate that free and easy wandering mentality of zhuangzi, where nothing seems to bother them, you know what I mean? They are the immovable object. You know, they flow through life, but are not stuck or affected to the experiences of life. You know, they know that attachment in and of itself can be a great hindrance. If you're attached to a lot of things, or to anything really, then that's going to be so hard to give up when death comes, and it does come.
Yeah, well, in Buddhism, it says that attachment is one of the biggest cause of suffering.
It is. Attachment is one of the biggest causes of suffering because you're attached to something that, in a sense, can go away any time. You know, we get attached to the most frivolous things like the material possessions and stuff like that. And, you know, we all know that once, say, if we buy a new car, you know that after 1 week, the attraction towards that car is dissipated. And it's just something that you have, but it becomes part of the background of your psyche that you're attached to, even though its freshness and that has it's lost its freshness with you, you know. So from the perspective of non-duality and the perspective of trying to come to the knowledge of Brahman or Tao or Sunyata, is that if you're attached to all these things, you can never experience that because you're attached to something that, in some sense, is not permanent and doesn't exist. You have to come back into contact with that which is eternal and permanent. That's the role of a jivan. Well, that's the reality of a jivan mukta, and the eventual as they say, that's eventually what we will all experience, you know, either in this life or the next, or what have you, you know. But Gaudapada would even say to that, even me saying that, he's like, there is no next life or that, this and that. It's just now, you know. You're talking nonsense, Jason. This is what he would say. You don't wait for the next life and this and that. There's no death. There's no birth. What you are fundamentally is here. Heaven on earth, whatever you want to call it, is fundamentally right here and right now, beyond all sorts of, you know, personal problems and subjective viewpoints. It's here, but you're in the way.
Yeah, like what that story that Alan Watts was saying in one of his lectures, that his experience when he went to India, in the satsang or in conversation with these great teachers, and this Indian guy was just going on with the problems and dramas that he has in life and this and that, and the teacher was like, "Get off it, Shiva! Like you're not the dramas or troubles that you think that it concerns you. That's not you. Get off it. Like you're not that.
Yeah, exactly.
You're Shiva.
You're Shiva. Yeah, that's who you truly are.
Yeah,
Shiva being Brahman. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
And actually, I think that we all need to hear that. See, a lot of people, they can be too emotional, you know. They're too attracted to drama and they're too attracted to, like, their emotions and expressing their emotions to other people. And yes, we need to be able to express our feelings and this and that. I'm not saying that. But we become too attracted to that, and that becomes our reality, you know. So all we're focused on is emotions. And then that, in some sense, is counterproductive to spiritual growth, because a lot of us need to hear what that guru said to that disciple when Watts was there. That's what they needed to hear. Like, they needed to hear, like, come off it, Shiva. Like, you're not this person here with all of these problems and all of these worries. You got to get out of that nonsense. Like, and I think, and I think that all of us need to hear that, actually, because a lot of us can carry on with our own personal problems, and it can be exhausting. You know, this is why in the modern day, when we do see modern Advaita Vedanta teachers specifically, may attract people who are not really ready for the path. And then when you go to a satsang, the satsang can end up being like a group psychology session, you know, like a group therapy, when it's not supposed to be that. A satsang, as you read from all the transcripts of the older satsang Advaita masters, who had satsangs, it's very one-dimensional, like trying to understand Brahman, trying to understand the true self. And what you see in the modern day, because we're so emotional and so forth and so on, you see that the satsang then can become, you know, can veer away a little bit from what a satsang is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about sitting close to not only a master, but sitting close to the teachings of the Upanishads, right? That's what a satsang is. You're supposed to be sitting close to the teachings of truth. And then people are coming because, you know, internet and this and that, there's people get attracted to certain teachers, and then they go to the satsang, and then next minute the questions and that can be very personal. And look, if you have a lot of personal questions and you have a lot of personal problems, what's better for you is probably to go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. You know, that's probably going to be more beneficial for you, because there are places for that. And yes, we do have personal problems. I'm not denying that. But we're talking about something completely different here. We're talking about what we've been talking about this whole thing. We're talking about that aspect of yourself that's beyond birth or death. But what is good when those individuals with all those problems, as you mentioned, do go to these satsangs, is that the teacher may say, like, come off it, man. Like, I don't need to hear this. Like,
Kind of a instant crack in your head.
Instant crack, yeah. And you do hear a lot of those famous stories, right? Those famous instant enlightenment stories where the teacher will sort of like crack them with that wisdom, like, stop this nonsense. Like, who are you talking about? You're talking about this person, if it's real and lasting. And it's not. It's this temporary wave, this temporary phenomenon that you're attracted to and you're attached to. That's been built over time. It's not your fundamental reality. And that's the good thing about when those people go to those places. Why I mention it can be a problem is when it becomes too focused on their problems and this and that, and they can't get out of that. They don't have the aptitude for the realization that we talked about. When you do crack them and they're instantly enlightened, so to speak, some people don't have the aptitude for that. Not at that time anyway.
Yeah, not everyone can be like that.
No.
Everyone has different aptitude.
Yeah. Everyone has a different path to follow in that sort of sense. But I would say everyone actually needs to go to a satsang. They need to hear from an enlightened teacher. But at the same time, a lot of people are not ready for that. If anything, as you know, I've been doing with this channel is to trying to talk about this deeper subjects that would actually be spoken about in those sort of secluded settings and putting it out there for people. And ironically, there's a lot of people that are interested and that actually resonate on the same level. And so there is a changing of perspective in the world with people who are kind of seeing that, oh man, like continuing this game of black and white of this and that and being this person is exhausting.
It is very exhausting.
It's exhausting, That's the thing, like, to get, like you and I have talked about before, like when you look at transpersonal psychology and they try to talk about, the person beyond the psychology, and transpersonal psychology is almost counterintuitive because to be transpersonal is to be transpsychological. You have to go beyond also your psychological faculties. And that's what Eastern spirituality aims to do. It aims to tell you that the reason you suffer is you're trying to promote this ego, this person you are, because you think that's who you are, and that's what's causing all the suffering for yourself, and eclipses your perception of how the world truly is. So what should you be doing? Should you be focusing on your trying to tend to your moods and tend to your psychology, or should you just be pulling the plug and game over? Instead of continuing to play the computer game, you're just no, just pull that plug out of the wall. I'm done. No more axe to grind. I'm finished here.
You cannot keep doing it.
Yeah.
Same thing over and over.
Well, Ramana Maharishi said that you need to finish it off. You need to stop this game. You need to finish it off. You're continuing to play this game and you think that you're this person, but this person is such a temporary thing. It's not even real. As we were mentioning before with how thoughts create the ego, you've created this continuity of thought, which has created this persona, which you think is who you are. And then we're in a world that's so busy and that promotes that individualistic perspective that you start to lose sight of that pure consciousness, that stillness within yourself at your foundation. You've completely gone away from that. And sometimes there's no way back for people, unless they do go to a satsang like that, or they have an ayahuasca experience or something like that, that really cracks their perspective, And that's what has to happen. And that's the process of all of those non-dual schools, and that's how they can come into contact with Brahman.
It's a practice has to be continuous, because right now we are somewhat accumulating memory, because whatever we were saying 5 minutes ago, it's in our brain as a memory.
Yeah.
As long as our physical form is alive and constantly interacting with the outside world, we keep accumulating these informations as experience, and that experience becomes our memory. And if we don't continue to practice, it'll get to you. It'll eventually get to you, and you just sometimes gonna react in a not a very healthy way, and while you don't even know it. it's so fragile, isn't it? Like what someone said, or in a book says, it's just like walking in a edge of the sword.
Mm.
Yeah, it's so fragile, our mind, state of our mind, and that state, that fully awakened state. So that if we don't give continuous practice and give good care, it's so difficult to remain in the present moment as that real self, as what we are and who we are. And that's why I sometimes really respect and admire these sincere monks who dedicate their life into this practice, because I fully understand that how hard it is to keep your mind always in check, right? Always mindful of your breath or body sensations. It's not easy task, but it's very important to keep practicing and continue to give good care for our mind.
Your focus should be single pointed on what we're talking about. That should be the focus in your life. And a lot of people say, yeah, but I want to do this and that, and that's right, but you can still do all that. But in the end of the day, when you're old and you can't do all those activities that you want to do, what will you turn to? And you'll turn to this. You will. You know you will. So why not start now and practice and study and have that single-minded attention for this? Doesn't mean you're going to stop other things. It actually will mean that those things may enhance. Those things may... Their purpose to you may seem more clear why you do those things, But you won't be possessed by them and you won't suffer because of them, It's really a choice of if you want to continue to suffer or not. This is what we're talking about, right? Do you want to continue to suffer or not? If you want to continue to suffer, continue to play this game of who you think you are. Continue to play it. It's okay because there's no crime. Most of the population in the world are doing it. They are doing it.
Yes.
So
Majority of
people. There's a small minority who are trying to exit the game. They're trying to truly wake up and experience liberation in this life, which frees you from this cycle of birth and death, samsara, and frees you from the illusion that you are even born or die, according to Gaudapada. It frees you from all that.
Yeah, all these activities that we enjoy to do and things like that can benefit ourselves in our life. But like you mentioned, once we start to identify ourselves with that, that's when the suffering starts. No matter how much you like and enjoy doing certain things, once that possesses you, that's where the trouble happens. So we gotta be very, very careful and mindful of that whether you truly enjoy doing it or you are possessed by it. So if you feel that you're possessed by it, you have to maybe stop for a little bit and just take a rest and have a good look in ourselves first. And if you're still inspired continue doing it, then that's fine. But again, just be mindful where you are at, really.
Yeah, of course. We all have to understand that the mind, as I mentioned before, is empty, spontaneous, and free. And like you said before, if we're continually filling it up with information and this and that, there's no chance for us out of this cycle, There's no chance. And one of the things that we can learn from, especially Buddhism, is that the problem with the mind is craving. But when we say craving, we don't mean it in its literal sense. Craving should be really interpreted as seeking. We have to, and this leans into Gaudapada's philosophy too, where we have to stop this habit of seeking, searching. Because in seeking and searching, we're still thinking in terms of time and space and past and future. we have to get beyond all that. And that seeking... See, the mind itself wants to experience itself, but it feels uncomfortable with its original nature. And so it seeks to solidify itself. So it seeks to objectify itself. That's why we create this ego, because it's seeking to objectify itself.
That's an interesting thing, isn't it?
It's an interesting thing, yeah. Because it's uncomfortable with its empty, spontaneous and free nature, which it is. And so the habit we have to get out of is seeking, because seeking itself will continue to create a future reality for ourselves, where we'll continue to play this game of black and white, this game of self and other and God and you, this complete game of separation, this illusion of separation. And so we have to get out of that habit of seeking. That's why the end of volition, or the end of will specifically in Buddhism is and in Hinduism is very important, because if you get rid of that seeking and that searching, then you come into this ever-present reality that always was there. But what you'll find there is you won't find yourself there. You won't find that sense of person there. You'll find just a presence, an awareness that's just there. And it's neither ecstatic or it's neither sad. It's just perfectly balanced.
Then this might be a bit of an odd question, but then why do we have mind if mind always tricks us all the time?
Again, that's the illusion of Maya, isn't it? It's the illusion that it's a part of the habit that we've been trained into seeking. We've been trained into linking thoughts, creating this train of thought, this continuity of thought, which creates this person. Mind itself is not... See, the problem... the other part of how you would answer your question is, what do you mean by created? There is no mind that's created. There's only ever-present consciousness. The uncomfortability happens when we are brought into this world, and it becomes uncomfortable for us to be that presence. So then we are trained then to see the world in a dualistic manner. We're trained to search and seek a future experience for ourselves, which is the habit we actually need to get out of. Because what does that do? What does the seeking create? The seeking creates fear.
So then Gaudapada didn't even acknowledge the mind?
Of course he acknowledged the mind, but not in the sense that, well, it was something that was created and has a birth and has a death, He's...
Or is that like an aspect of consciousness or not?
Of course, from his perspective, mind is an aspect of consciousness. In the same way as matter is an aspect of consciousness. You see? We have to really make a distinction. See, a lot of people get confused between mind itself and consciousness. Most of the time when we talk about mind, we're really talking about mind stuff, right? The activity of the mind. So like if we say to each other, my mind's disturbing me, what you're talking about really is the activity of the mind, right? It's not the mind itself that's disturbing you. Do you understand what I mean?
Activity of mind.
The activity of mind is disturbing you, right? This constant thinking, ruminating, projecting.
Mind is jumping around.
It's not the mind itself. It's the mind stuff, to use yogic terminology. The stuff in your mind is disturbing you. The mind itself is empty, spontaneous and free. So to answer your question before, what creates the mind, what you really are talking about is what creates mind stuff.
Activity of mind.
The activity of mind. And you and I know what creates the activity of mind. Experiences, the way we're trained to think, and this cognitive error we have where we perceive ourselves as separate from everything else. All of this, adds to this affliction we have within the mind, where our mind is constantly active and agitated. What we're doing with spiritual practice is you're trying to clean that closet out. You're trying to get rid of this mind stuff in some sense. And deeper you go, the less that mind stuff begins to influence you and have power over you, and then it's gone. See, sorry, love. for example, like when we've been to satsang with Muji a long time ago, and people will say, and even Muji himself talks about this, talks about the mind as being the problem, but the mind, what he should clarify is the mind stuff. It's not the mind itself. The mind itself is empty, spontaneous, and free. It's just the mind is, in its pure state, is consciousness. It's empty, spontaneous, and free, and that's how we actually naturally experience the world. Because nature is spontaneous and free and empty. It doesn't have a logical meaning or conclusion. There is no meaning to life. The problem is when we accumulate all of this stuff in our head, this becomes what we think of as the mind, but it's just mind stuff. It's just activity and memories and the samskaras and the subconscious that are affecting our natural state of mind. You see? So we just get disturbed, right? So the natural state of mind is empty, spontaneous, and free, but then you've got all this crap. It's like having a house full of rubbish, and you're living there. You know what I mean? You're living in this house full of rubbish, and you're like,
It's not very good.
not very good. It's just too much work to clean. You know what I mean? So then people just, what can you do? But what you've been talking about with this emphasis on spiritual practice is you pick up the broom, you pick up the shovel, you pick up the dustpan, you start cleaning that bloody apartment right now. And you get it spick and span. That's what you need to do. And that's what you're trying to do with the mind. The mind is stainless, purely stainless.
Then, is there such thing as I don't know, using the mind in a healthy way?
Well, of course. Of course. But it's like what we were talking about before. You have to come back into accord with the mind's nature, which is empty, spontaneous, and free. So you deal with the reality spontaneously. You know, this comes back into like Zen training with koans and that, right? So when you look at what are they trying to do in Zen Buddhism with koans, what they're trying to do is, so we understand that the thoughts are unsupported, right? These thoughts that bubble up in our head, within our mind, are unsupported. They are not naturally dependent on each other. They only become dependent on other thoughts when we grasp the thought, which brings and trains it out. So what happens in koan training is that what you're trying to do is you're trying to act spontaneously, but to also to be appropriate to each situation. Do you see what I mean? So when a situation arises, and all situations arise, well, most situations arise spontaneously, circumstances and situations arise spontaneously that you have to deal with. So because we're caught in this linkage of thoughts, right, where we grasp a thought or we grasp a memory, and we, like we mentioned before, jealousy, and we deal with the situation in an incorrect manner, you're not acting appropriate to that situation. You're looking at that situation as if it's a past experience, but it's a completely new experience, but you're looking at it through a past lens. And then what happens is you distort that reality because you're projecting your past onto that reality.
And you're repeating it.
You're repeating the cycle. And so what Zen koan training is about, like you said, is when you were talking about how does the mind act naturally or behave naturally, or how do we use our mind efficiently, is to come into that sort of koan perspective where you experience the world naturally, but spontaneously, but because you've trained, you've gone through a lot of meditation and this and that, your mind is not sticking to each thought. So you're not creating this continuity of thought. So what you're doing then is when the situation arises, you act spontaneously, but you act with immediacy and you are appropriate to each situation. I mean, that's like one of the heightened perspectives to get to, obviously, in all of those spiritual traditions, is to get to that natural state. And it's very difficult for any of us, right? But think about it simplistic, like when you have a good conversation with someone, why was that conversation good? because you're engaged in the conversation, and you don't have a lot of preconceived ideas are going into the conversation. You're engaged in the conversation, and you're
present.
You're present, and you're acting immediate and appropriate to whatever this exchange of energy is. But that's got to be our life, our daily life. That's how the mind acts naturally. That's the non-dual consciousness. That's the non-dual consciousness, because spontaneity is non-dual, right? It's just there. It just grows, and it just happens. And non-dual thinking is actually how the mind really is. The mind thinks non-dually, but we've created this idea of continuity of thoughts where we grasp thought, and then we relate it to memory, and then we suffer accordingly. Or we experience states of ecstasy. We might have a fantasy about a certain partner, and then you meet someone else and you project those same qualities onto that person. It works either or. So the mind itself, like when we look at Zen Koan training, is we have to actually align with what the Zen masters are teaching. And all of these traditions is we have to live a life of spontaneity, because the nature of the mind is spontaneous. The nature of the mind is empty. The nature of the mind is free. So how are you completely free? Well, you need to have a mind of no deliberation. And what I mean by that is, like, when something arises, you act naturally and appropriate to the situation. And then what happens? That may mean, in some sense, that you have to react appropriate in a situation that may not be positive for that person, but it's appropriate for that situation. But what happens is, because you've reoriented your focus into a state of consciousness where you are in alignment with the unsupported thought, then you don't hold on to that experience. It comes, it goes, and it's like the wind just went through your ears, and the experience is gone. You know what I mean? And you don't accumulate any karmic stock. This is the idea of being free from karma, right? Because you're experiencing the world, but you're not attached to your sense of self, and you're not attached to the experiences that you have. They happen just as a cloud in the sky. They happen just like a cloud in the sky. The cloud in the sky, but your mind is like the pure blue sky.
That's a so clear way to look at the real function of mind, because we both experienced place like in Tiruvannamalai in India, because the presence of the Arunachala, where the sage Ramana Maharishi was there. A lot of people come and go, and we hear some conversations just just restaurants and things like that, and people say when they talk about mind, mind, you don't have to look at mind. That's something that you put in your pocket, you never look at it. But that's a very immature way to see what mind really is, right?
It's a lack of understanding too.
But what you just said about the Zen master and Zen stories, and the healthy, the natural nature of mind is empty, and how to act out of that natural mind spontaneously, appropriately in each situation, in the moment, it gives us much clarity into how we can really train our mind and use our mind correctly.
Exactly. So what you said about the people in Tiruvannamalai, it's interesting, because why I say it's a lack of understanding, and to elaborate on what you're saying, is that if we look at it from, say, like a yogic perspective, the mind itself is just this tranquil, transparent, reflective water. And when you look into the water, Brahman is right at the bottom, or Purusha, to use yogic terminology, or to stay in sync with what we're talking about, Tao or Sunyata, is shining through this mind. But when the mind is, what we're doing is we're throwing rocks into that pond, and we're making ripples in the thing, and you can't see that nature. And so the only time it's empty, spontaneous, and free when the mind is when the water is tranquil. But if we're constantly throwing boulders and buses into this pond, then the water is all like this and disturbed, and then all you see is reality like that. You see it in this very fragmented way, and your personality becomes this fragmentation of your pure mind. So the mind itself, the way to see and experience Brahman and Tao and this and that, your mind has to be in that tranquil state, and you have to be acting in that manner, in that empty, spontaneous and free manner. So when you hear people saying, I put my mind in my pocket and this and that, it's kind of it's pretty much an immature statement, because you're acting as though you can defeat your mind. So it's the height of the ego to think that you can defeat your mind.
It's like it's there, but almost, I don't know, maybe it's too scary to look at it.
Mm-mm.
So just want to ignore it and put it in your pocket and not looking at it.
You become a schizo. No, you will.
Yeah.
You can't do it. The thing is that they're thinking about mind in the wrong way, like we were mentioning before. They're talking about mind stuff. They want to put the mind stuff in the pocket. When you say you want to put the mind in the pocket, it's like saying you want to put your eyes in the pocket, because the mind is just an organ like your eyes. But the problem is sane people don't put dirt on their eyes, right? Because you can't see. What we're doing is we're throwing activity and experiences in the mind constantly in information, and it's like putting dirt on your eyes. You can't see, and your experience of the non-dual reality is distorted. That's what's happening. And so that's what they should be saying. They should be saying, I put my mind stuff in the pocket. I don't put my mind... That's what they're kind of alluding to, you know what I mean? But as you know with my channel, I try to be specific because there can be a lot of misinterpretation. And I think with a lot of... Some teachers can, in the modern day, not be as specific, and that can lead certain students down the garden path,
Yes, because certain terminology can be a bit confusing, but there has to be clear interpretation of these terminology. I guess it's because too abstract and it's hard to grasp, but it has to be addressed correctly.
Yeah.
Because yes, people have different understanding in different things, so you have to come to a clear understanding of what they really mean.
Exactly. Terminology and concepts will build a healthy framework, and people need to understand that. And if we're not doing that, then the Eastern spiritual paths, there can be a lack of understanding, a misinterpretation. And this is going to, confuse people to no end. And we do find that. So we don't want that. And that's what we're doing in this podcast. We're trying to eliminate all of that. And we're trying to, gear people towards in the right direction, especially in how to think about this, and so that we can all dive deeper. It's easy to wax lyrical. If you're a teacher, it's easy to wax lyrical from your perspective, but not see it from the student's perspective. And we've all been victims of that. But we do, even when I was younger, being a student, not understanding certain things from certain teachers because they were speaking from where they are. There was not enough clarification. And that then became my job to go out and try and find it on my own. And that's important for other people as well, because you don't want to get to any sort of place where you're saying, I'm going to put my mind in my pocket, this and that, because that's a lack of understanding of what the mind is. And so with what we've been talking about today, the mind is empty, spontaneous and free. And when we experience that, then we experience what Gaudapada said. We experience Brahman in this immediate moment as the eternal moment, the ever becoming, the ever eternal becoming, but something that's beyond life and death, the birthless, the deathless reality, that non-dual reality. And we can only come to that with everything that we've been talking about. So that'll do it for today.
Yeah, it was really, really fruitful, nutritious conversation.
All right. All right, guys. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you guys next week.